revenues. The town at that time had not had this vast increase. I'm going to say there were maybe 2,000 people in the town then. I may have the figures wrong, but that would be approximately correct. And when I'd been growing up, maybe there'd been 1,400. So they did it. It was a wise thing to do. A little later on, they began to acquire large tracts of conservation land, thanks to people like Shirley Cross, who was magnificent. I can remember, getting a phone call. And she said, it's coming before the town meeting, the acquisition of this land. And she would call up 300 or 400 people that she knew and say, we need to acquire this land. It's going to be, houses soon. If we don't do it, we've got to do it. The price isn't very great. And 300 or 400 people would turn up at her behest because she had this phone list and she telephoned everybody, and she was very compelling. And one of the, I think she had a PhD in botany, and she died just a couple years ago at age 92, driving her pickup right to the end of her life. Any case, so a lot of things were being done then for historically and in terms of conservation.
So those are all conservation lands now?
Those conservation lands, they never did cost $1 an acre, but they never did cost what 20 acres can go for now, which can be easily, 800, 900,000.
Well, that kind of flows us into your love of the history of the town, the rich history of the town, and after you retired to Cape Cod, you got involved in a number of things, and we're going to talk about those now. So in whatever order you want to speak about the Historical Commission or the Historic District Committee or this Community Preservation Committee, CPC. What was your involvement and what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I've always been involved in committees and so forth. I think that's one of the obligations that any citizen has. They should be in somehow participating in the community. When I was down in Florida and living in Polk County, I was on a committee for the whole of the county. We were involved with all sorts of things, conservation issues and things of that kind. It really was intended to be sort of a comprehensive kind of look at master planning for the county, which is almost the size of Cape Cod. They're big places down there. Any case, so I've always been interested in trying to do community sorts of things. When I came back here, I talked to some people I knew and got interested in the Sandwich Historic District Committee, and served on that for a number of years. And at one point was the chairman of it. And that, of course, as you know, is the regulatory organization for all of the construction that takes place in Sandwich and the other 5 communities on the north side of the Cape, and handles everything north of the Mid-Cape Highway.
Old Kings Highway.
The Old Kings Highway. And of course, nobody likes to use the full name of it. It's actually the name of the committee is the Sandwich Old Kings Highway Regional Historic District Committee. And so I'm aware sometimes it's confused with the Sandwich Historical Commission. And of course, in all truth, sometimes many of the people who have moved into Sandwich get a little confused about the two of them. I remember years ago when I'm related to Thornton Burgess because my family goes way back here in Sandwich. And I remember meeting him once. And then a number of years ago, the inn burned down. And then it was built again. And I remember talking to a selectman when I came back here, and he said, "Isn't it wonderful that we've had this Sandwich Daniel Webster Inn, it goes right back to 1692. And of course, that was the earlier one that burned down. And that particular selectman wasn't quite up to date.
Now, you've seen some changes in the village over the years, and I think we talked about there actually being for the better, and that how some of the property had deteriorated, and then it's certainly come back. And what was the role of the CPC, and what is the CPC, and how did that? And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, if one had to talk about sort of the history of the maintenance of the village, which of course is where my house is and which is the original part of the town, aside from maybe, let's say, Spring Hill and a little bit in the Forestdale area. Around 1950 or so, many of the houses were not being painted very often. There was some deterioration there. And on the other hand, that was the whole community. And as things became more prosperous, the houses were better painted, better taken care of. The town began to invest in conservation land, which I mentioned earlier. And also, the town began to invest in some buildings such as fixing up the Hoxie House and that sort of thing. But there had been a period in more recent years before the CPC when the town's public properties began to deteriorate substantially. The town hall is an example of that, which of course has had this rebirth as a result of the community preservation funding. And I think that happened in some ways in many communities all over the Commonwealth, which was the impetus for the creation of the Community Preservation Act. And as you know, all the towns on the Cape are part of that. That's an option that a community decides on. And before that, the town had been investing in the land bank. And that was the predecessor of the Community Preservation Act. And that, of course, as its name suggests, was for preserving land. And so those funds, again, were used for conservation purposes and so forth. So, but you couldn't do things like recreational facilities. You couldn't do affordable housing. And you couldn't do historic rehabilitation and restoration. And so these other ones became, and I think it was very wisely about, I'm going to say 6 years ago, that the town decided to embrace the Community Preservation Act to broaden out its work in taking care of its facilities. And it's been doing that. But there was a real need for it because the town was letting its buildings deteriorate. And that probably is a consequence of the vast expansion of the town and the consequence of a lot of needs in the school community. And if you think about the value of most houses and the taxes that they pay in the town, each house can pay maybe for half of a child in the school system. So it takes two houses to support one payment to pay for a child in the Sandwich school system. So, and as you know, the decision years ago was made that there would not be an industrial base here. And two good reasons for that. First of all, there was good reason that the Sandwich Glass Works moved out. It's easier to have a big factory right in the middle of the country. It's easier to have a big factory near coal or natural gas. It's easier to have a big factory near railroads that can shoot the stuff out in all directions and not just have one railroad that's going across a body of water and then having to go and so forth. So all of those reasons, there are no places in the world where there are large industrial complexes on islands and or on narrow peninsulas. And that's true of Cape Cod. So it was an unusual happenstance that there was a factory here in Sandwich at one time, and that it was the largest, or one of the largest, glass factories in the world.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I'm going to bring you back to, speaking of the glass factory, I'm going to bring you back to one of the items that your family has given on loan to the Sandwich Glass Museum, and it was a glass piece that was done by your ancestor, John Jarvis, when he was still a single man. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Actually, John Jarvis was not my ancestor. He was my great-grandmother's first husband. And he fell in love with my great-grandmother when he was about 20 and she was about 16. And her father was the, I guess, sort of the business manager for the glass works. And so they probably met that way. Any case, he fell in love with her, and her parents were a little bit nervous. Here she is 16, being wooed by the son of the owner of the glass factory, and she's awfully young. So her father's full name was, well, it's the abbreviation you often see. C.C.P. Waterman was his name. And they lived on Main Street, had a house there. And supposedly this 16-year-old and John Jarvis, they would meet under a large tree that was in front of the house. And then they would walk with some friends around the village. Any case, she was 16, and her parents decided this was not a good idea. He was a good catch, but it was not a good idea. And so they sent her off to a place where the Waterman family had some relatives in Hudson, New York. And there was an academy there. The Hudson, I think, Female Academy was what it was called. And she went there to school. Now, John Jarvis was very much in love with her. And so in the spring, he visited her there and brought with him a glass chalice engraved with a knight in armor on it and his initials on the shield of the knight. And any case, I have the letter that Mary Waterman, the young girl, wrote to her mother. And that letter says, "Dear Mother, I do miss being back in Sandwich and so forth, and I greatly miss the death of your mother, my grandmother. I wish I had been there to see her before she died." And then she says at the end of this letter, and I think the purpose of the letter was the end of the letter, was that John Jarvis came and visited me in Hudson, New York, and came and he brought me a beautiful chalice, which I will have to show you when I return to Sandwich in the summer.
Her name's on the back?
And her name is on the back of it. So this was really an engagement gift. I think they were engaged maybe 6 months or a year later. And Deming Jarvis provided the funds. John Jarvis was then had been hired by the factory to work as the chemist there. And because he had graduated from something called the Lawrence School at Harvard, which was sort of an industrial school, which later on ceased to exist, but existed at that time. And so they got married eventually and had 2 children. And he developed tuberculosis, which was then known as consumption. And apparently was something in the Jarvis family. And he died. Both of their children, they had had 2 children, both of them died. I don't think of a consumption, but something else. And so she was left a widow. So she, a number of years later, remarried. And when and that was my great-grandfather that she married. And when she was 39 and he was almost 70, they had my grandfather. So that's the connection and how the house passed down through this other passage, which was my great-grandfather, Dr. Leonard.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, and that item is presently on loan at the Glass Museum, and I know your wife is involved with the Glass Museum. So tell us a little about your thoughts about some of the museums in town, with particular respect to the Glass Museum and its importance to the town.
Well, the Glass Museum began many years ago as and this is way before my time, but as the Sandwich Historical Society. And historical societies tend to be sort of the attics of the towns that they are in. They sometimes do a lot of research, but sometimes they simply accumulate things. And that's what the Sandwich Historical Society did. It accumulated a lot of things. But I think they began a number of years ago, many years ago, to realize that the great interest that there was in sandwich glass, and also that the history of the town in terms of the glass industry was very significant. And so over the years, it became really the Sandwich Glass Museum. And I believe that that's really the repository in many ways of the historical memory of this industrial enterprise that existed here in Sandwich. My wife works there as a guide, and a number of other people do the same. It has a lot of volunteers, any nonprofit, and I have only worked in my life for nonprofits, and I believe that they serve an enormously significant role in the United States. They are omnipresent everywhere. That's not true of Europe. My wife is, people may know, is originally Norwegian by birth, and I met her after she came to this country. Incidentally, last week was the 50th anniversary of her arrival in the United States. But in any case, the Sandwich Glass Museum is extraordinarily important for the town. The town has now 10 museums, surprising for a little town like this. And some of them are really, in a sense, owned by private owners. They are the historic districts themselves, the National Register Historic Districts. But there are places like the Nye family, the Nye homestead.
Which is where?
Which is on Old County Road. And then there is the Wing Fort House, which is out on Spring Hill Road. And there are, of course, Heritage Plantation, which is a relative newcomer. This is only its 45th year. And the Hoxie House, of course, and the Dexter Grist Mill, which, there are, and then I guess the most recent museum would be the Canal Visitor Center. So all of these, now exist in a museum coalition, the Sandwich Museum Coalition. And at the moment, I'm Secretary-Treasurer of the Sandwich Museum Coalition. So I've got my fingers in different areas. But I think it's enormously important that people be involved. And all of these institutions have wonderful support from the townspeople and from places like the Cape Cod 5-cent Savings Bank, which has been supporting many of them in different ways. And for the Museum Coalition, it's been supporting it in terms of putting out a Heritage Trail brochure. So all of these things converge.
Great. Is there anything that we did not cover that you'd like to talk about before we close out?
Well, I think we've covered a fair a range of towns. Let me mention a few memories I have from the war, the Second World War. That would have been, now of course, having been born in 1937, it began when I was 4 years old, and it was over, I guess, when I was, what would that be, 44 or 5, so that would be more like 8 or 9. You don't have very profound memories about that, but I have a few. I mentioned the war effort of collecting cigarette wrappers. I have memories of my mother, who had a very elderly car, a pre-war car, obviously. And whenever, and you didn't get much gas. There was gas rationing, not as only food rationing, but gas rationing. And so whenever she was on 130, and I can't recall why she'd be up there, but maybe it wasn't going to the dump. But in any case, up there, she would turn off the ignition. And she had it timed so that we could go the entire distance and into the driveway at 3 Jarvis Street. There wasn't no hedge at the end of School Street, and there certainly weren't many cars. So you could not have to take your foot off the brake when you made that turn onto Main Street. And you certainly didn't have any problems from Main Street getting onto Jarvis. And there was, if she did it just right, there was just enough energy to get her up into the driveway and over the crest of that little hump and into it. So I remember the complexity of all of that very well. The other thing I remember is listening to the radio once, and it was describing the Red Army moving into, and it was someplace in Europe. And I thought, gee, that's wonderful. I wonder if other armies come in colors too. And I remember asking, you know, what are there green armies, blue, what kind of colors? So you know, those are the kind of memories you have. You also have memories of. I didn't see a banana until after the war, but everybody was able to get banana flakes, sort of powdered, flaky bananas. I don't know how these were being manufactured and how they were being imported. I really have no idea. But I remember not seeing a banana until, you know, after the war, because of course they would have come up from Central America and probably, you know, U-boats would have blown them up. I have one further memory about the war. I think it was right at the end of the war. A ship went ashore, a freighter, right near the entrance to the canal. And I don't know really the circumstances. I don't, you know, remember them from that time. But it had a cargo on it. The cargo consisted of a number of very unusual items. First of all, there were, I think it was almonds or walnuts or something like that. There were a lot of nuts on that ship. And if you went down there, everybody got some nuts. There were plenty on the seashore there. And then there were badminton rackets. What they were doing in the cargo in this time of the war, whatever, I have no idea. But a lot of people got badminton rackets. And finally, there were Oriental rugs. Only the first people that arrived there got the Oriental rugs. Then there was a final cargo, which nobody tried to get. And that were giant rats, ship rats. And these shipwrecks came ashore. And I know my uncle's house, which I think we mentioned was across the street from me, they got into that house, some of these enormous shipwrecks. And I can remember once that, hearing this tale from my mother, that she was living in there part of the time. And in the middle of the night, she had a dachshund who slept on the floor near the foot of her bed. In the middle of the night, he leapt up on the bed, sort of quaking. And apparently what had happened, one of these enormous rats had come into the bedroom up through a hole in the floor and had gotten into my mother's blue jeans and became trapped somehow. These were on the floor. And the dog became extremely frightened. This was a dachshund. And the dachshund was just trembling in fear of this thrashing around on the floor. So in any case, it finally cut a hole out and disappeared down into a hole in the floor. But I've always thought that cargo that arrived was symbolic of something, but I've never quite figured out what.
Well, leave us with some happy ending here with the rats. I assume Uncle got rid of the rats eventually?
Uncle got rid of the rats, little pieces of tin covered the rat holes, and they were eventually dispatched, and that problem didn't exist anymore.
We don't want to end with the rat story, so I'm letting you know that you're going to receive a copy of this DVD, and I'm sure your children and grandchildren will get to see it, and your wife. So at this moment, I'll let you gather your thoughts as I'm telling you that it might be a good time to say whatever you like to say to your children, grandchildren, wife with regard to your own life and their role in your life.
Well, I hope that some of the things that I've said may be actually fresh for you, and that I haven't worn you out in the past by exhaustively mentioning some of them. And for my grandchildren, who are 4 and 8 and 10, I hope you enjoy this.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Johnathan.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Okay. We're done. It was good. Very good. Thank you.
Well,
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, and they can see
Jennifer,
that.
okay.
Well, I hope it's
Well, it was good, yeah.
got some things that can be used.
Well, I did an interview with Mrs.